is if you're going into a new role or even your role is changing in some way, I'd really encourage you to take a look at the first 90 days, the book, because it's not a theory book that just says, well, in theory, this is what you should do. There's some real actionable tools that I used, a lot of them, as I was moving into my role. And even if you're not going into a brand new role, I still think there's some techniques in there that are helpful. So I'd suggest taking a look at that. I found it to be exceptionally helpful.
Technology is transforming how we think, how we lead, and how we win. From Intervision, this is Status Go, the show helping IT leaders move beyond the status quo, master their craft, and propel their IT vision. The first 30 days of a CIO's tenure can be difficult to navigate. Expectations are high for both the organization and the CIO. Add to that a relocation halfway across the country, and it can make for some very interesting dynamics. In our continuing series, The CIO's First 30 Days, we have talked with first-time CIOs, veteran CIOs starting with a new organization, and tenured CIOs looking back to their first few weeks in the office. Today, we are talking with Mike Mead. Mike is the CIO for CNO Financial Group. CNO is middle income America's valued financial security partner. Mike joined CNO 2 years ago after spending over 20 years with the global behemoth AIG. Welcome to the show, Mike.
Thanks, Jeff. Pleasure to be here.
I'm really excited to dig into our conversation as you and I have had an opportunity to be on calls over the last several weeks and really start to talk about your background. I'd really love to start there. I want you to, before we dig into that background though, I want you to take us back. It's 2018. You are walking into CNO as the new CIO. What's going through your mind? What's on your plate as you're walking in those doors?
Yeah, it was weird. I experienced an emotion that was mostly foreign to me, Jeff. I was nervous. I had been with AIG 22 years, and
Mhm.
I had changed jobs within AIG, gone to different locations, but I had a network of contacts, connections throughout the company. And here I am in Indiana, coming from Texas, and it was a brand new environment. I knew nobody in the city, nobody in the company, so I was worried. So it was a bit of a scary proposition, which was a bit unusual for me.
I bet it was. I've never experienced the relocation aspects of it because, even if you're starting with a new company, you've got the people that you network with outside that company, your friends, your neighbors, your colleagues in other organizations to fall back on. But moving to a new city, new company, brand new experience after a long tenure at AIG, that just had to be frightening
Yeah,
in a way.
it was indeed. And that hiring process, Jeff, was interesting too because when I got the job offer, I was so excited, really excited to start. I was just finishing up at AIG, and they told me they're like, "Well, we need you to start right now." And I'm like, "Well, I'm relocating my family," and it's so basically from offer date to start date was 3 weeks.
Oh,
And
wow.
so I basically took off, left my family in Texas, said, well, we'll move later. Found an apartment here in Indianapolis, and on the plus side, because I was here by myself, I could focus and basically work nonstop, which I did. But it was pretty daunting, but it worked out well.
Well, it seems like it's been a good fit. So you'd been in the financial slash insurance sector for a couple of decades by the time you're walking in those doors. But what things surprised you as you started the new gig?
Yeah. So the way I'd prepped coming in, Jeff, there's a book called The First 90 Days, and a huge fan of the book. I've used it twice now for two roles, including this one. And I used a lot of the methods outlined in that book. And as I was coming in, the main thing I tried to do was to not judge too fast or make fast, big decisions, which is incredibly hard for me because I'm action oriented, fast decision maker. it just, I was like, okay, slow, Mike, slow. And
Hmm.
so as I came in, one of the things that surprised me was the company culture. I mean, it was a shock, but thankfully it was a wonderful shock because I was used to a more cutthroat environment. I
Uh,
mean, not just fast paced, but just, I would say just tough environment, kind of get things done or get out of the way. And what I found at CNO was an environment where that there was this and is this sense of we're all in this together. We're pulling in the same direction. Even though IT is a support function, I found that both associates and leaders across the company wanted me to succeed and were like even overly helpful. It was incredible. And so CNO quickly became and has remained my favorite company. It's really my favorite job ever. And it's really because of that culture. And that surprised me in a very, very good way.
that's awesome for you to hear you say. I love it when someone finds the place that they feel most home at. I mean, that sounds silly for a work environment, but it really is. The culture is so important, and the fit with your personality and the way that you like to operate. That's an important thing to look for. And so in the interview process, did you get glimpses of that as you were talking to them?
Yeah, I did. I would say uh, the interview. It was one of those situations. By the way, interviewing sucks. I just
Yes, it
and
does.
looking for a job is just awful. I hadn't done it in so long, and I just, to be honest with you, I have changed how I interview and how I interact with candidates, and really try and be more responsive and not leave them hanging. And I know we
Hmm.
don't always do perfectly at that, but when you're on the candidate side, it's just I did not enjoy that. I'll just be
Yeah,
frank with you.
yeah,
Thankfully, CNO did it wonderfully, and that was part of that. When I went through the interview process and was able to meet with the executive team and to a person, they were just fantastic to talk, and it really felt like a two-way street rather than them just interviewing me. There was also they understood, hey, I'm evaluating them. Is this going to be a
yeah,
fit for
yeah,
me? So that was a good process, and by the end of the interview process, I was a bit, I was just so excited. I was like, I want this job, and
yeah.
so I did get the sense, but it was even much more than I expected in a very good way.
That is great to hear you say about the interview process, Mike, and I appreciate that vulnerability to share that interviewing is just hard and it's uncomfortable, and because I think it's great for our audience to hear that even an executive, someone who's been at the top leadership positions in an organization, going into a new interview with a new organization, it's uncomfortable, and it's okay to be uncomfortable. But I love how you turned that and said that you've changed the way that you do interviewing because you realized that it is an uncomfortable situation. I love that. So what are some of the things that you've changed in your interview process as a result of that?
Yeah, so I've actually started, and not always, depends on the interview, but started giving fast feedback.
Mhm.
Sometimes even to where, like, what an interviewee I don't think would expect to hear. So I'll give you an example. I was interviewing for a role earlier this year, and I had a candidate that was clearly qualified. They were wonderful, smart, capable, experienced, everything you'd be looking for, but they were missing some elements we were looking for in the role, some specific experience, etc.
Mhm.
So I just gave them the feedback during the call. I was like, look, you're great. This is a piece we're looking for. I don't think there's a fit. And I gave them feedback during the call rather than letting them hang, letting them,
Yeah.
think, hey, it went great. And then you either don't hear back for a while, or once you hear back, they're not sure why. And, in that case, it had nothing to do with their qualifications, capabilities, anything like that. It just wasn't a fit for the role. So, and again, I can't always give that kind of specific feedback in an interview, but where I can, I do.
And that is so helpful to a candidate to receive feedback and know why they weren't a fit. I think is valuable. It gives them the opportunity to maybe fill in those gaps for the next time that they're interviewing. So I just think that is a fantastic approach to give that feedback. So many people are nervous or they shy away from giving that feedback, and I think that's great that you've taken that on when you can. That's fantastic.
Yeah, now that we talk about it, it makes me realize, man, I got to do more of that. I got to do better. So
Yeah.
I do it
Well,
some, but I can definitely improve.
well, I think that goes without saying for all of us, man. We can always improve in a lot of areas, and I think that interview process, because it is so uncomfortable, I think if we look at that, there's lots of things that we could do to streamline that, make it go quicker for the candidates, make it go quicker for ourselves as hiring managers. I think all of that can be improved in a lot of organizations. So I want to talk about kind of that first 30 days, the first 60 days. I imagine that you went in with some idea in your head about what you were going to be doing in that first 30 days, that first 60 days, even though from offer to start date was, I think you said 3 weeks.
Hmm.
My guess is during those 3 weeks, you were thinking about what you were going to do.
Absolutely.
So when you got there and you had a chance to get your feet under you a bit and figure things out, how did your plans change?
Yeah, I had to go slower than I expected, and although kind of I mentioned earlier, my approach was okay, go slow, don't make big decisions, assess, 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 figure things out before you do things. What ended up happening was my team still started teasing me about going at what they called Mead speed, which which is fast. And so I did, for example, one of the things is I looked at our organization structure, and this is probably no shock to anybody when new leaders come in. It's almost a 101 playbook that you're going to reorganize in some way.
Yeah, yeah.
And as I looked at it, it was clear I had a different vision for how to structure IT. And so I wanted to do that quickly, and it became clear that was a bad idea to do it too fast. So although I was assessing, I pretty quickly saw, okay, this is what I wanted to do.
Hmm.
And what I learned was in meeting with my direct reports, my peers, HR, others, pretty much across the board, everyone didn't really capture the vision of where I thought we should go. And
Hmm.
I realized I've got to slow down before just saying, boom, here's the new structure. And
Yeah.
by the way, ultimately, we went mostly to that structure I originally had envisioned, but there was a lot of buy in, a lot of discussion. And if it was just my vision, it was going to fail. So I really had to spend some more time getting input. And by the way, we did modify some things with some great input from others in the organization. So that was one of the changes.
Hmm.
Um, Another was our plans. We were working on a big outsourcing contract, and uh, it ended up that we needed to accelerate elements of that, and I didn't expect that. So there were quite a few things that just because every situation is different, and I
Yeah.
had to start modifying how I was thinking of things.
So I love that concept that you had a vision for what you wanted to do, and you realized quickly that uh, you needed to bring people along to get that buy-in. What are some of the tactical things you did to include them, bring them along, paint that picture for them of what your vision was and why? What were some of the things that you did?
Yeah, so I was really fortunate. Our HR department has a organizational change management function, and there's a great guy in that group, John Greco. And John came in and partnered with me, and he kind of coached me through it. And so what he had me do was we basically started. We put a plan together, and of course, as an IT person, project plans, milestones, things like that. So we put a plan together, but the plan wasn't detailed out on the actual reorganization. It was the organizational change management or OCM plan on, okay, how do we get everybody pulling in the same direction on this? And it
Hmm.
really entailed a lot of meetings, get brainstorming sessions, sessions where I would share my vision and my ideas. and then others in the organization, which included my boss, some of my peers, definitely my direct report team,
Hmm.
and where we go through a series of what are we going to design this, and I learned a lot through it. I expected that I know what I want to do, let's go do it, and I, I didn't just learn what we needed to do, but it actually became a bringing together, I think, of those different groups
Hmm.
of relationship, understanding, almost just that team concept started occurring as part of that OCM around reorganizing.
So, what were some of the changes you mentioned that as you went through this process, you got input from these various stakeholders, and you incorporated some of your ideas, some of your vision changed. Could you give us example of what is something that changed as a result of going through this process?
Yeah, so uh, one of the things was just our overall approach to the reorg. So it wasn't so much the structure, because to be honest, IT support function IT structures, there's not that many different options.
Yeah, yeah.
So that wasn't really the complex part of it, but it was more what happened was we expanded it from just a let's move the boxes around, let's people report to different managers kind of thing. It went much deeper than that to where we realized, for example, one of the things that became a rallying cry and something we really wanted to focus on was agile transformation. Well, we had a project going on with agile, but we didn't have a plan around agile, and so we started looking at how can we position ourselves with our first round of reorg so that we can be set up to move into more of an agile structure as our next phase. So actually, what we did was some people, when we did the reorg, moved into a very similar role that they had before. But we actually had many people that were able to apply for different or new jobs and job descriptions. So I'd say the reorg again wasn't just moving groups or just structure, but it was kind of changing some of our jobs, our processes, how we interacted with each other. So what the biggest thing that changed was I'd say the scope of the reorg, which by the way, meant it took a lot longer than I originally envisioned. The
Hmm.
end result was so much more powerful.
I think one of the things that stood out to me as you were describing that, I love the fact that you slowed down, even though you were anxious to get going because I'm sure there's things that you want to be focused on rather than a reorganization, but you slowed down to bring your team along. I think the other thing that stood out for me in that, Mike, was that you brought in someone from HR, someone who is in organizational change management, OCM. You brought them in to help. Has that? This will be kind of a leading question, I think, but so many times, and I've been guilty of this myself as a CIO, when we're getting ready to do a big project, we value engineer the OCM, the change management function, out because that's always this big line item in a project. Has that changed your view on using OCM for large initiatives, or is that something that you've done throughout your career?
Yeah, I wouldn't say I've done throughout for sure. And there's been times where I've had access to that kind of function or capability, but it's really been it's the most mature capability at CNO that I've uh, been exposed to or had access to, and it's really been helpful to us ongoing as well. So it kind of I think depends the situation someone may be in or what ability there is there. I'd say if it's not available internally, though, I've become a believer in getting some kind of help, even external consulting help, if you don't have that capability internally. Because I've done a lot of IT culture transformations, OCM, different things, but that doesn't mean it's my area of expertise. Getting help is, I think, really smart, and I recommend it.
I love that because you have to know where your strengths are and you have to know where you need that help. So I think it's fantastic to know that about yourself, because you can't do everything. I had another question, and this is not one that we talked about, Mike. So I want to put you on the spot a little bit. And we had a webinar earlier this week with several CIOs on a panel, and one of the things that they talked about was the concept of agile leadership. Not necessarily agile as a methodology, but we did get into that quite a bit in the conversation. But they talked about this concept of pandemic mode versus incrementalism. And what they were saying was, as we're recording this, it's we're in the midst of the pandemic. We're fall 2020, and they have seen an increase in speed in the work within their department. The business is coming to them and wanting things faster and faster because of dealing with the pandemic. And so they kind of talked about that as pandemic mode. And then the old way of doing things is more incrementalism. So you talked about using agile, but have you seen an uptick in the speed and the demands on your department this year?
It's been huge, absolutely. I'll give you one example. We were, we IT were in the midst of selecting and deploying Microsoft Teams. So late last year, we worked with Microsoft, selected that as our collaboration tool set. In January, IT started testing it, and we all know what happened in March.
Yeah,
It was the fastest deployment and adoption of technology I've ever seen, not even close. I mean, it was unbelievable how fast both IT reacted and had to react, as well as how quickly I would say our associates or the rest of our organization, our business folks, adopted a technology. And it feels like, outside of all the other things going on with the change happening in our world and all the challenges that are going on. I've noticed that as we do other things that aren't quite as, I'll say, desperate or urgent, must do type things, there is a more open willingness to change in the technology world. And I think we kind of had a bit of a breakthrough. And, as with many things, something as negative as the pandemic has been, I think there are some positives coming out. And that's one of them. I've seen more of a willingness when we say, hey, we're going to press out. For example, we're rolling out new security technology with our email, which led to changes for our organization. And there's kind of a more of an openness or understanding. And when things don't go perfect, it's a little it's easier, I'd say, than it was
yeah.
before in a very good way.
Well, I'd say that was kind of the consensus among the panel that we talked about, is that the openness to change, maybe some of the maybe a reduction in some of the process and procedure, not to the negative, but just maybe bypassing some of that to get things done quickly. And so there's talk about how do you continue that forward and keep that relationship, that almost that stronger newfound relationship. How do you keep it going? So I would love to dig in with to that with you at another time, because what I want to do right now is take you back even further than 2 years ago. You had an opportunity in your career that not many have had. You volunteered to go to Malaysia for AIG and execute a turnaround of a division. So I have a three-part question for you.
Okay,
First, what led you to volunteer for that assignment? Second, what was that like for you and your family? And third, how did that experience prepare you for your current role with CNO?
sure. So the volunteer story, several things came together in that. One, I had a career coach, and they were working with me. And just a side story on that, they asked me, "Hey, what's your career plan?" I said, "I don't know, work hard, and I'm sure jobs will come up. They keep coming up." And they said, "That is the worst career plan I've ever heard." Like, I don't know, it's worked for me so far.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
and they really challenged me and said, you know, you work for a global company, and we look at your executive profile, and you have no international experience. I'd traveled international, that kind of thing, but they said, you know, that would really round out, you know, some of your skills. I said, huh, interesting. And within a month, I knew AIG's operation wasn't going great in Malaysia, and so and that there was going to be a job opening there leading the organization. So I went home one day and I told my wife, I said, "Hey, remember how we talked about when we first got married? Wouldn't it be fun to live internationally? Wouldn't it be great?" And we would dreamcast way back, and that was 20
Uh-huh.
years prior. And so I said, you know, I think if I raised my hand, they'd send us to Malaysia. And I had traveled there on business before, and so she'd heard about it, but of course never been there. And so we sat our boys down, and my middle son at the time was a junior in high school and on the baseball team and all that. And we said, "Hey, what would you guys think about moving to Malaysia?" And we were really worried about him because they don't have baseball in Malaysia, and that was kind of his passion. And he said, I'll get my suitcase. Let's go." We're like,
Oh,
wow,
wow.
okay. And then my oldest son said, "Well, I'm graduating high school in 2 months. I've got a scholarship to Baylor. What about me?" And we said, "Well, good luck and Godspeed. You know, you're a big boy." And he said, "Well, wait a minute. I want to go." And we said, hmm. So long story longer, I guess. They selected me for the role. And my oldest son ended up coming with us and did a year of university in Malaysia, which is a really interesting side story.
Oh,
And
yeah.
that's how we ended up there. So, and then you said about the experience. I got to tell you, one of the greatest experiences ever. It just was eye opening. It was our perspective of the world and just of people and cultures was just greatly expanded. Brought us together as a family. We went through some hard times, which again brought us even closer together.
Hmm.
And it was just, I would recommend it to anybody, full stop, if you have an opportunity to live and work internationally, wherever it would happen to be. It's truly life changing. And, you know, you asked how it prepared me for the new role.
Yeah.
I'd say probably the most difficult thing about going to Malaysia, you know, IT is IT, technology is technology, but the culture was very different.
Oh, yeah.
And the country culture, the people culture, the company culture was all different. And so it was a real learning for me on how to, I guess, go in the same direction of the culture and work with, you know, not what I had done before wouldn't work, right? Some of the methods and things I had done, you couldn't template it for a different culture. And so I think that prepared me for coming to CNO. I mentioned earlier that the culture at CNO was different in a good way, but some of the things I'd done at AIG, some of the things I'd done in Malaysia, it just it wouldn't apply. It just wouldn't work. And so you really, I'm going back to that assess phase,
Yeah.
that understanding, okay, what is the culture? What is good about this culture that we can capitalize on? What are the elements that aren't working? And so I think it taught me to be open to the fact that what worked there won't work here, or you know, how do I need to tailor some of the methodologies that I use that will work in this environment?
I think that is a great point about the culture being different and what worked in the past isn't going to work there. And I think that applies where to our listeners who may not do a stint in Malaysia, but may move, say, from Dallas Fort Worth area to Indianapolis, Indiana, right? Like you did there. The cultures are different, and you have to be ready to reassess. So, eh, right now, as we're sitting here today talking, Mike, we are a week or two away from your 2-year anniversary
That's true.
with
Yeah.
CNO.
Yeah. Crazy.
Looking back, knowing what you know today, what would you have done differently as you walked in those front doors 2 years ago?
Yeah, I did think about this one. And by the way, thanks for just this whole idea of looking back has been really healthy for me. And so as I was thinking through that, I'd say one of the things was I mentioned the reorganization and how we expanded it and it became more complex, but I think ultimately really positive. But what ended up happening was the reorg ended up being in parallel with our outsourcing contract renewals, and doing both at once was brutal. And
Oh,
I
I
don't mean just on me, I mean on my organization, on my team. And so, and I got to tell you, they are so resilient. Our IT associates at CNO they're just amazing, and they persevered. And I think in some ways, everything we went through in that, all of that last year prepared us a bit for some of the struggles we've had this year, just from a COVID and other perspectives. So I think I would have, if I had to do it again, I would have figured out how to do that faster so they didn't end up going at the same time,
same
because
time.
it
Yeah.
really led to a lot of uncertainty for our organization. What one of the decisions I had made, and this is, there's real tension in this decision. Still don't know if it was the right one, but was to be really transparent about the reorg. So there's, I kind of put reorgs in the two camps. You have the surprise, you plan it behind the scenes, and then ta-da!
Yeah.
Everybody, guess what? We
Yeah. Yeah.
reorganize. And then there's the we're going to reorganize and we're going to be transparent and keep you posted every step of the way. And that's the method I chose. I really prefer that, because we deal with professionals, people, and I think they appreciate being in the know. So I
Yeah.
think that was the right thing. However, it went on so long that I think it created a real burden and stress on folks on my team. So that's one of the things that I would figure out how to do that faster,
Pastor.
would
Yeah.
be the biggie.
So, Mike, as we've talked about, and I'm sure you've had a chance to listen in on a couple of Status Go
Mhm.
episodes, we are all about action. In fact, it's in the name, Status Go. So, what should our listeners do after listening to you and I have this conversation today? What should they do differently tomorrow?
Yeah. So a first answer, I guess, if you're going into a new role or even your role is changing in some way, I'd really encourage you to take a look at the first 90 days, the book, because it's not a theory book that just says, well, in theory, this is what you should do. There's some real actionable tools that I used, a lot of them, as I was moving into my role. And even if you're not going into a brand new role, I still think there's some techniques in there that are helpful. So I'd suggest taking a look at that. I found it to be exceptionally helpful. Um, Another would be is I'd suggest, I've talked a lot about culture, and I really believe, we're technologists, and I I believe technology is the easy part of the equation, and it's actually much less important than the people. And so I'd encourage our listeners to look at, what, not just what is your culture, but is it the culture you want? And
Hmm.
if you say, well, man, I wish we did this or that, do you have a plan? Because that's one of the things we started to develop. And to be honest, we're still in progress, but we have a project plan. We have a plan for how to achieve the culture we want to get to.
Oh,
And
excellent.
it's not perfect and it's evolving, but if you don't have an intentional plan for your culture, then you're just going to get what you got, and it's
Yeah.
probably not what you want.
Want.
So I'd encourage you to be intentional about it.
I love both of those actions. And for our listeners, we will put a link to the book that Mike references, The First 90 Days. I happen to have a copy of it on my bookshelf, so I can say without a doubt it's an outstanding book. A lot of great tools in it. So thanks for bringing that one up, Mike. And this concept of having a plan for creating the culture you want. I've not heard anybody else talk about that. I think that is fantastic. So thank you for both of those actions.
Of course, my pleasure.
And Mike, I really want to thank you for taking the time to do this podcast. I know how incredibly busy the life of a CIO is. I know at this time of year, especially in your industry, it can be crazy. And so we appreciate you taking the time out to talk with us today and share with our listeners.
Oh, it's been a pleasure. Thanks for the conversation.
To our listeners, if you have a question or want to learn more, visit intervision.com. The show notes will provide links, including the one to the first 90 days, and will also provide some contact information. This is Jeff Tunn for Mike Mead. Thank you very much for listening.
You've been listening to the Status Go podcast. You can subscribe on iTunes or get more information at intervision.com. If you'd like to contribute to the conversation, find Intervision on Facebook, LinkedIn, or Twitter. Thank you for listening. Until next time.